welcome everyone to our lunchtime lecture. My name is Billy Chabot, and I'm the executive director here, and I've been here for 16 years and I still love it. So one thing I just wanted to mention, who is a member at Seward House? Yay, thank you so much for being a member. We missed you, we want you back, so the rest of you are not yet members, right? So I'm just going to do a little push. If you do become a member and you're a new member, you do get our little gift bag, which we redesigned this year. This is a silhouette from around 1830, and it is hanging in the parlor of the museum. If you visit the museum, you're going to hear the story about that silhouette. You do get the bag. You can sign up for our beautiful newsletter, which is always nice, right, Jeff?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Wonderful stories in our newsletter. We print that 3 times a year. You get discounts to our programs. You also get invited to our Christmas VIP party, which is members only, and it is really, really nice.
Very good.
The other thing I want to mention, if you become a member at an upper level, 125 or above, you also get a membership to the North American Reciprocal Museum Program, NARM. And if you're a museum person and you visit a lot of museums, so many museums are NARM museums. So for example, the Art Museum in Rochester is a NARM museum. All of the museums in Newport, all the historic mansions are NARM museums. You get free admission to those museums for 2 people. So that upgraded membership at Seward House Museum gets you a NARM museum membership for a year, which is really great. And on their website, you can see that they have almost 2,000 museums across the country, also in Mexico and the Caribbean. So it's North America, Canada too, our friends in Canada. So it's a really nice benefit that we have. And laying in the back window right there where Jeff is standing, I've laid some copies of just our programming. Actually, it just goes through May now because we're getting ready to issue another newsletter that will come out around the first week in June. But I've also just printed off some membership forms for you. So those are all laying back there if you're interested. Everything is also on our website, so I would encourage you to check that out. And that is my membership pitch. You did good. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to introduce May. Thank you.
Thanks, Billy. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm so pleased to introduce Judge Richard Dollett. Just kidding. Hopefully you received your email or saw online that we had to make a last-minute substitution. Judge Dollinger sends his regrets, and we will have him here next month. He had some health issues that prevented his coming. Ordinarily, that would have meant a cancellation in addition to a postponement. We did not have to do that because the museum is blessed with great supporters, members, and friends. Perhaps none greater in our hour of need this week than Professor Robert May. I checked my email history, and we've been friends for 11 years. It was in 2015 that Professor May and his wife Jill came for their first museum tour. From that first tour of the house has bloomed a really wonderful relationship. Professor May has spoken here and helped the museum on a number of occasions. His first program was way back in April of 2018 on Confederate monuments and memorials and the appropriate way for handling them in the future. That was such a provocative evening that he and I went to the MAM conference, the Mid-Atlantic Association Museum Conference in Baltimore, and talked about the way the museums can serve as third sites for facilitating hard dialogue like this. He was back in 2019 for his book Yuletide in Dixie. We went to WXXI together to promote that in the Seward House Museum. During COVID, he was our kickoff speaker for the virtual lecture series. He's twice before been a planned speaker for Lunchtime Lecture in 2023. He helped launch the museum to the Schaefer Conference, Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations in 2023. And then last year, based on an accumulation of so much knowledge of Seward family history, he crafted a specialty tour, Objects that Tie into Seward's Diplomatic Legacy, that he gave for us last April. He and his wife came for lunch last week, and we joked, this is the first time in 8 years we haven't had you on the schedule formally. And the universe thought, well, that can't be. And so we're very sorry Judge Dollinger's not here, but we're very glad Professor May is a Professor Emeritus of History at Purdue University and a preeminent scholar of American diplomacy and the Civil War era. Today he's going to take us behind the curtain of his most recent book from 2024, well reviewed across the board. I'd like to read to you briefly from the Kirkus review of this book. In this book, historian Robert May takes readers on a detective caper as he investigates a story that reaches back to colonial America and continues today. May finds no evidence of the Yule Log tradition, stay tuned, in the historic record, instead showing it originated with pro-Confederate lost cause propagandists attempting to present the South's pre-war system of human bondage in as softest tones as possible. Debunking the Yule Log myth does more than correct the historical record. It serves as a highly instructive case study in the process of historical myth-making. This captivating tale will appeal to all readers interested in African American history and the long struggle to support white supremacy by creating a mystical antebellum American South. And here to tell us more about that book and the making of it, for the 8th time, Professor May.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'll just say my wife and I have been members of this museum for quite a while, and the membership's well worth it. I read the newsletter religiously, and anytime I'm in this area and a friend or a relative comes through, if I can talk them into driving up to Auburn and taking the tour, I learn new things each time, and I love the tour and I love the house. So it's well worth membership. I particularly think it's important to talk on what I'll be talking about today because it's actually more timely than you might think. We think of, Yule logs as something kind of an archaic tradition. There's a Christmas cake kind of that they call a Yule log. You may have heard of that in ancient Britain, they had these ceremonies that tied in with the winter solstice, and the Nordic states had them too. And so on and so forth, and you may think, what a quaint title. What does it have to do with Seward? Well, were any of you at the talk last Thursday night about Seward and the coming of the Civil War? Yes. Yeah. Well, if you were, you would know that I actually spoke out toward the end of the talk during Q&A, and I raised some questions about the talk, which struck me as kind of that there was a subtext to the talk. The talk was about how Seward tried to prevent the outbreak of the Civil War and all the efforts he went to stop the Civil War from starting. And I felt the subtext to the talk was that deep down it would have been good if the Civil War had been prevented. And it struck me that that kind of a subtext totally omitted the attitudes or perspectives of basically all of America's African American community, not to mention a lot of other people in the country that had the Civil War been prevented, African American enslaved people in this country would have had to endure generations before slavery would have disappeared. I do think sooner or later, like the speaker, I think it would have disappeared eventually, but to consign African Americans to enslavement, to keep the Union together without a war, it seemed to me was an unfortunate subtext. And I think it's especially unfortunate because it sort of implies that slavery wasn't all that bad. And it strikes me we sometimes forget the inhumane aspects of slavery and how cruel it was. And I think there's lots of evidence that we're fighting this battle in our society now. We have cultural wars going on where we're trying to eviscerate the teaching of slavery in our national park system, in our public schools, in our public libraries. Books are being taken off shelves, in colleges even. And that this goes against the spirit of open inquiry, and it's dangerous. And the fact that I'm speaking within 1 week of the Supreme Court's decision on the Voting Rights Act, which is in a sense an outgrowth of the slavery problem. Why do you need voting rights for African Americans? Well, because of the legacy of slavery in this country. Supreme Court's basic view is we put that all behind us. and we don't consider all that anymore. And so with that in mind, let me talk about the Yule Log, which I think reinforces the point I'm trying to make here, that a harmless story about Christmas time in slave times in the Old South before the Civil War, that this harmless story actually has done a lot of harm. And it's a story that I've found on tours, like touring the Seward House. I've been to historic homes in the South and plantations. You can run into the story in colonial Williamsburg. You can run into it in a lot of southern plantation homes if you go on tours. It's also in encyclopedias. It's in the encyclopedia. It's in African American encyclopedias. It's in the Encyclopedia of Southern Culture. It's in children's books like biographies of Harriet Tubman, who Seward had a very close connection with. And of course, Seward himself was very anti-slavery, and he and his wife Frances tried to liberate enslaved people who ran away and came to this area. Seward worked with Harriet Tubman. So I think it's actually an important story because the story gives a very pleasant picture of slavery. And on the surface, you say, why would anyone object to this story? Well, the story goes that at Christmas time, on southern plantations, the masters let the enslaved people have extra long holidays. So they got huge amounts of time off from work. It could be a week, it could be 2 weeks or more. And that this time off from work was calculated by how long the plantation's Yule Log got to burn. Okay? And that the enslaved people were always really clever. So what they would do is they'd go out, they'd cut down the greenest log they could, then they'd take their green wood, soak it in the water. Some accounts said they soaked it in the water for a year. They prepared this Yule log for a year. Then they drag it, kind of dripping across the grounds to the master's hallway or bedroom or dining room or whatever, wherever the big master fireplace was, put it in the back of the fireplace, and as long as it didn't break in two, they got Christmas off. So they got these long, wonderful vacations when they partied, they ate all they wanted, they drank all they wanted, they visited their relations on other plantations. Great, great picture. The problem is, number one, I wasn't sure that Americans ever actually celebrated Yule logs at all, anywhere in the country. And then second of all, I first ran into this story when working on my first book on Christmas in slave times, Yuletide in Dixie. I read lots of planters' diaries. I read lots of escaped slaves' narratives, autobiographical accounts. I never saw anyone, travelers who went through the South before the Civil War, they never mentioned that anyone was burning even a Yule log, much less that the slaves were soaking the Yule log in water and tricking the master into giving them longer holidays than they were supposed to have, and so on and so forth. So I was suspicious. Got done with my first book and I thought, well, what am I going to do next? That's always an issue. I don't like to stop writing. So I decided that I would methodically investigate this Yule log story and see what I could find. So that brings up what I'm up to, and now you're up to snuff on that. And is there any proof for this log? Well, before I get into that, just a quick mention of this picture. Supposedly George Washington had a Yule log, or so you would assume from this oil painting from the early 20th century. It shows the Yule log being dragged into George Washington's home. And of course, George Washington was a large slave owner in Mount Vernon, or his Mount Vernon plantation. And you can see there's a Yule log being dragged by oxen. Riding the oxen are black horsemen. And to get at this idea that when they had Yule logs in ancient Europe, they always celebrated with music and decoration, sometimes by sprinkling herbs on the Yule log and so on. So you can see Yule log, I don't know how well you can see it, but it's kind of decorated, and it's being led in by an African-American musician playing what I think is a fiddle there. So that gets at it. It shows how pervasive this Yule log idea is. And then it comes up in a lot of writings. Booker T. Washington, the most famous African American in the country between Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois. Washington wrote an autobiography. How many of you have read this book? Yeah, see, there are people in this room, 3. I've read it. I read it growing up. And it was almost a required read. It was one of the most widely read books in America for decades. And it's his autobiography. He was the principal of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a black teacher training and vocational ed kind of institution. And he became very famous, knew Teddy Roosevelt, stayed in the White House, ate at the White House, advised President Roosevelt on patronage and stuff like that. So, and he tells this story about the Yule log and how the slaves tricked the master, not only in his autobiography, but also in an article he wrote for Suburban Life, which was a magazine some years later. And then that story is repeated today. So if you visit Booker T. Washington's place in Virginia, in Roanoke, Virginia, near Roanoke, where he grew up, and it's a National Historic Site, you're likely to be told this story. They've had reenactments. Some places even have guests carry in a Yule log, or they have dressed up black reenactors bring in a Yule log. Anyway, so Washington wrote about it in his autobiography, published in 1901. So there is some proof for the Yule log story. And Jenny Proctor was a one-time slave, still living in the 1930s. And when an interviewer for the Federal Writers Project, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal program to put unemployed writers to work, went into the South and interviewed her like over 200 other slaves were interviewed for, ex-slaves were interviewed for this project. Jenny Proctor repeated the same story. And here you have two pieces of African Americans saying this story, and then there are plenty of white accounts. Okay, fine. The problem is every single account, and some of them I read for my first book, that I had ever seen on this project, on this custom, was published around the year 1900 or later. No one during slave times told this story. And so that's why I was suspicious and decided to investigate. Okay, so I finally found a couple of pieces of evidence from before the Civil War, and they were really close to the Civil War. So even if these stories are true, they don't explain, the centuries of slavery before these stories were related. No evidence that this existed. But in a Maryland newspaper in 1847 during the U.S.-Mexican War, they told the story of the Yule clog, Christmas night, and you can read down, an old water-soaked gum tree insured the slaves a week off from work, and so on and so forth. So I found it in a Maryland newspaper finally in 1847 because I was looking harder. And I found it in a novel. I found 3 pieces of evidence from before the Civil War. This was Harry's Vacation. In the novel, you have people around a breakfast table, I think in New England. And they were all having a meal at Christmas time, Christmas holiday. And one of the visitors says, I wonder, if they celebrated Christmas down south or something like that. And an Englishman at the table says, yes, and I spent a winter there. This is all in my book, so I won't describe the whole thing. But basically he says, if you lived in the South at Christmas time, you would know they have these Yule logs and the slaves get long holidays. So I found 3 pieces of evidence. The problem is, this is by an English immigrant who wrote this novel, and England is where they most celebrated Yule log stories and wrote about them. And the other 2 pieces were just hearsay. I mean, I have heard that they give the slaves a week off. We still don't have a single, let's see, so you're going from 1607 to the Civil War, that's about 2.5 centuries of slavery, not a single piece of eyewitness evidence, not even a diary in which a planter says, I gave the slave, the Yule log burned extra long this year. I gave them a special holiday or something like that. Okay, so I still hadn't found anything. So, when did they start telling this story? Really telling it? After the Civil War. Well after the Civil War. In fact, 1877 is the real break point, I think, for this story. A poet from Virginia, related to the famous Randolph story family, which is related to the Jeffersons, writes this poem, The Backlog, or Uncle Ned's Little Name. Uncle Ned wasn't the author's uncle. Uncle Ned, it was a term it was a derogatory term for elderly blacks on plantations. You call, and this term was used after the Civil War too, for elderly blacks. You called them uncle and auntie. So Uncle Ned is an elderly black slave. And what happens? Well, he's a slave at Thornton Hall, which still is celebrating customs according to colonial times. And one of those customs is the Yule Log. And Uncle Ned and his fellow slaves cut down a log that burns and burns and burns, and the master's being cheated out of work for days. And so the master gets frustrated in this case. And what happens in the poem is finally the master says, I've got to know how they picked out a log that's going to cheat me out of days of their labor. And so the master gives Uncle Ned so much booze that Uncle Ned gets plastered. And then the master says, so just tell me, Ned, how did you ever get a log to burn that long? And Ned finally confesses, So the story always is that the slaves trick the masters. And then the stories usually also have the master, instead of getting angry and whipping the slaves, they always say, they laugh, they like being conned, and they basically send the slaves back to their cabins. There's no punishment, no whippings, nothing. And so it's a cute story. It makes everyone feel good. It made me feel good the first time I read this story. How wonderful, the slaves treating the masters. I've always supported underdogs. That really got to me. I love that. But then on the other hand, the master comes off as a pretty good guy in these stories. He doesn't punish the slaves, right? So, at any rate, that's Uncle Ned. The year is significant. The story is told at Christmas time. It's written up and published in several newspapers, and then it starts spreading. It's even told in college orations. But the year's Christmas of 1877. Does anyone know what's the significance of 1877? It's the year Reconstruction ends, radical Reconstruction, when they gave blacks the vote and they gave them office holding privileges. And you can see the tie-in with the Voting Rights Act today. So that they're in the process of taking it away. Federal troops are stripped away from any role in Southern politics in 1877. And that's the year that a Southern poet feels bold enough to tell this story that really gives a pretty good picture of Christmas in slave times in the Old South. And in fact, in the late 19th century, in all our leading magazines, they're running series, they're running all sorts of articles by some of our most famous authors of the time, talking about how wonderful slave times were. Not all of them discuss the Yule Log story, but it's a whole genre of literature that emerges in the South. I would say at least 50% of it, maybe more, written by Southern white women, who it was one of the few occupations you could do if you were a white woman, especially after the Civil War is over and you're no longer working in factories or in government. There were a lot of women who got out of the home during the Civil War because the Confederacy was so desperate. But now they're back in the home. What can you do? Well, you're right. And it also makes you reputable within your society because you're saying things that people want to hear. At any rate, so there are a whole bunch of things that come out in the late 19th century. No one wrote more about Yule logs than this woman, LaSalle Pickett. Now, does the name Pickett ring any bells? So who's she married to? Mr. Pickett. Confederate General George Pickett, Mr. Pickett. And Mr. Pickett dies early. She has one of the longest widowhoods in the South. She has decades, I think 3 or 4 decades to write if she so chooses. And she also gets a bunch of government jobs. But LaSalle Pickett writes 4 different pieces on Yule logs and helps spread the story. And she is a defender of General Pickett and the Confederacy. We should never forget that the Confederacy was not just an effort to defend one's home side, one's fireplace. The Confederacy was an effort to perpetuate a way of life, an economy that revolved around the profits of enslaved labor. White Southern planters were among the richest people in America. The most wealth was in the South. It more than wiped out the wealth created by Northern manufacturing and railroads, and we should never forget that. Okay, so LaSalle Pickett, for instance, writes an article for the Ladies' Home Journal, one of the biggest, most widely read magazines in America then, as I believe it's still going, right? Yes. Yeah. Christmas issue. These things are almost always published in Christmas issues. And it's an amazing piece, but it's not exclusive. She's not the only one doing this. But the piece goes on about how glorious Christmas time was in the old days on the wonderful plantations. And it's filled with black dialogue. They go on. She can remember what black slaves said for pages at a time. I mean, pages of remembered dialogue. It's amazing. I can't remember what Jill told me this morning. And she can remember 30 years later every word that blacks said on over the Christmas holiday. It goes on for pages. And there are all sorts of ceremonies. They bring in the Yule Log chanting these amazing songs. And it goes on. And she's not the only one who does this kind of stuff, but they tell this wonderful story about Christmas time. And so I won't go into the other examples. I have a lot of this stuff in my book, but the Cameron sisters of Hillsborough, North Carolina, were 2 of the biggest perpetrators of the Yule Log story. And by the way, they were leading Confederate women. That is to say, they knitted shirts for Confederate soldiers. You read their private diaries, and they damned the Yankees. They said they wished the Confederates had slain thousands more Yankees at Bull Run. They hated the Union, and that was Rebecca and Anna Carroll. Here's more on Pickett. Here's LaSalle Pickett with George, supposedly. It's a drawing. Okay, and then LaSalle becomes, she spreads all her stuff, all her stories. She wants to restore Pickett's reputation because, of course, he was defeated in Pickett's charge. And so she spoke at him at Chautauquas all over America. She was one of the leading Chautauqua speakers and spread the Confederate, the brave Confederate soldier mythology. But she's also writing about Yule logs all the time. One of, I mentioned the Cameron sisters. This is Confederate General John Hunt Morgan. She heard that John Hunt Morgan was going to be in town going through in a railroad stop in Hillsborough, and she had to go see him, and she literally swooned when she saw him. I mean, these are people who just adore Confederates, just adore Confederates. Okay, now this is very important. This may be the most significant slide I show you in a way. This woman, Sarah Rebecca Cameron, who wrote many of these Yule Log stories, or wrote the Ladies' Home Journal one, she had a cousin that she was very close to, Alfred Moore Waddell. Waddell became the leader of one of the worst race riots in American history. So why did he do it? Well, before the riot, the same woman who wrote about Yule logs is writing in private letters. Wilmington is on the North Carolina coast, and because it's in the coastal area, it's the plantation area. And they had the most enslaved people in North Carolina, just about around there. And they also still had a large black population at the end of the 19th century, which meant they had enough votes still to elect blacks to office. So whereas in almost the entire South, Blacks by 1898 had been kicked out of office. They were still holding office and voting in Wilmington, North Carolina. It was a pocket. And I believe it's Wilmington that sent the last black congressman from the South to Congress until the Civil Rights Revolution. But don't quote me on that, because I'm not entirely sure, but I'm 90% sure. I'd have to look it up. But at any rate, Sarah Rebecca Cameron writes her cousin, Alfred, and she's, you know, hours away in Hillsborough, and she basically says to Alfred, you know, you're not a man. That's what her letter amounts to. She says, you're not really a man. If you were a Southern man, a gallant white Southerner, you and your fellow men would have gotten rid of black voting by now, and black office holding. You know, basically she was saying, shame on you. Alfred Waddell then led one of the worst race riots in American history, and I believe he then became mayor of Wilmington, which tells you these women on the one hand are writing about the glorious days of the Old South at Christmas time, when masters loved their enslavers. When enslaved people loved their enslavers, and masters in turn adored their slaves. That's really what these stories amount to. And if you doubt me, this is LaSalle Pickett's Old Time Virginia Christmas story in Harper's Bazaar, which is still around. It was Christmas Eve. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It was Christmas Eve in my dear old Virginia. This is the Virginia that had slavery and seceded and became the capital of the Confederacy. Richmond did. I was at my grandmother's, where all the family would hold their annual reunion the next day. The Yule Log horn sounded its cheerful note. The great hickory log, which had lain through months of golden sunshine and mellowing rain, was carried in on the shoulder, excuse my language, I'm just reading what she wrote, the strongest Negro on the plantation, followed by a rollicking troop of Christmas revelers, white and black, from the oldest to the youngest, from the master to the most impish little pickaninny. All had an affection for the Yule log. It sounds so nice, doesn't it? It's using racist language to make a racist point that slave times, while they might have, she doesn't say she wants to go back to slavery exactly, but that's almost the impression you get from this, that slave times were better. They were mellow. They were pleasant for everyone. This late 19th century Currier and Ives image shows the same kind of thing about the Old South. Currier and Ives, their prints sold all over America. And here you have a black cabin, undoubtedly on a plantation, where the blacks in the picture look well dressed, they look relaxed. You know, it's a very pleasant picture of, quote, Negro life in the enslaved times, okay? And stereotypical view of plantation Christmas, gift giving to enslaved people. This was actually before the Civil War, but gets at the same idea. They're taking ideas that were promoted before the Civil War and then transposing them into the late 19th century. But here you see the slave-owning family giving gifts to the enslaved people at Christmas. And here you have the blacks on the plantation living it up at Christmas time. They're having these wild dances, and they play banjos, and they're happy, and they're well dressed if you look at the picture. And here's the master's place, the column mansion in the distance, so that's interesting. What's also interesting is you've got the master and his wife, and probably other members of the white family there, visiting the slave quarters. They love their slaves in these things, and in these stories, in these pictures. They want to admire their happiness and watch them dance. They get a kick out of it. They like them. This is a very pleasant picture of slave times. Okay, finally, I'll just say, I just threw this in because Washington got his education at the Hampton Normal School, which today is Hampton University in Virginia. and there's a monument to him on campus, even though a lot of people criticize him today. He became an icon in the black community. Okay, now one last thing I want to end on. Part of my research, and I spend the final chapter of my book answering the question that many people have, well, what really did happen at Christmas time if this is all a myth? And I go into what you learn about it from the slave autobiographies, from letters, from planters' diaries, from planters' journals, and so on. And what I found was a lot of evidence. I found evidence that the average Christmas holiday for blacks, and there's overwhelming evidence, was 3 to 4 days. It wasn't a week or 2 weeks or anything like that. And more important, I found evidence that it was always the master who made the decision, not the slaves. They didn't trick the slaves into those holidays. The master decided in advance how many days he was going to give them, or his overseer decided. And that's what they got. And so if you read closely, even black sources, like Frederick Douglass and his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of an American Slave, he goes into the Christmas holidays on the Maryland place where he was enslaved. And in it, Douglass talks about how long a Christmas holiday they got. And he says, we got our holiday by the grace of our masters. By the grace of our masters. In other words, master made the decision, not the slaves. And that's what you see over and over again in the evidence. So I've actually, on purpose, talked fairly fast because I've been informed that I sometimes run over. And so I have timed this. I've kind of raced through it with the idea that we had a pretty big audience today. And I wanted to give you time to ask questions. And I can get into aspects of my work and what I've found, aspects of anything I've talked about today. But that's the formal part of my talk.
Bob, can you just briefly talk about, you mentioned the sewers, and you mentioned, but I know when you were upset, one of the things you were thinking about was the Crittenden compromise and the allusions at that speech to what that meant to Seward and his work.
The term Crittenden may not mean much to you. It's a very well-known Kentucky family. And Crittenden John Crittenden was in Congress, in the Senate. And when South Carolina seceded from the Union, and it was pretty obvious other southern states would leave too, and they'd form their independent country. Crittenden, being from Kentucky, and you gotta imagine what Kentuckians are thinking. If there's a war, who's gonna get the brunt of it? Well, northern armies are gonna come through Kentucky to get to the south, and southern armies are gonna go through the Kentucky if they ever want to invade Indiana or Ohio. And so Crittenden was bent on warding off the Civil War. And so the Senate and the House both formed committees to try to come up with some kind of a scheme that would keep the Union together. And Crittenden proposed this lengthy plan to solve all of America's, supposedly all the problems with the North and the South, except, of course, to end slavery. There was no proposal for that. But all the things that were disturbing relations, like the fugitive slave law. Well, I've spent a lot of I've written about the Crittenden Compromise in 3 different publications, because the first part touched on something that's very dear to my own research interests. Crittenden proposed that because Northerners and Southerners had been arguing about slavery's expansion for years, and you've all heard about bleeding Kansas, now they fought over Kansas. Well, Crittenden said, the way to stop fighting is just to draw a hard line across the territories and say anything north of that territory can be a free state, has to be a free state. Everything south can be a slave state. Okay? And the thing that made this line special was the fact that most of the West was already decided by previous legislation. So there wasn't going to be much more territory admitted from the West anywhere, north or south. California was already a state. Oregon was already a state. You know, much of the West was decided, and the rest was already in territorial form of one sort or another. But the Crittenden Compromise had a little phrase in it that said slavery would be permitted not only in current U.S. territory below that line, but in any territory the U.S. acquired after the, after the compromise from now on. And that meant anywhere in the South. Now, consider that Brazil had one of the most successful slave societies in the whole world. Slavery still was going strong in Cuba, even in Puerto Rico. And what they were almost, and parts of many parts of Latin America had once had black slavery. So they were almost giving an invitation to Southerners. Crittenden was giving an invitation to go out and conquer new territory for slavery and grow which would have given the South enormous new strength in Congress to protect slavery forever, more electoral votes so they could control the presidency and the Supreme Court. And now you have to remember, Seward and Lincoln both had committed their careers to stopping slavery's expansion. That was what the Republican Party was about. They were the leaders of the Republican Party the last couple of years before the Civil War. Seward, in fact, was the leader of the party. Almost everyone expected him to get the nomination for president in 1860. They were both committed. The one thing that united all Republicans, whatever political background, was we don't let slavery expand another inch. And so basically Lincoln says to Republicans in Congress, I'm your president-elect. If you want to stay loyal to me, you do not go along with this compromise, not another inch for slavery. And once Seward, of course, is going to be Lincoln's Secretary of State. When Seward learns this from Lincoln, indirectly, he, through Thurlow Weed, who was his closest political confidant, the editor of the Albany Evening Journal, basically Seward goes along with it and is against the Crittenden Compromise too, and it's buried. It doesn't get any Republican support in committee. Now, Northerners who liked slavery would have allowed it. Stephen Douglas of Illinois, Lincoln's famous opponent, he approved. He had been an imperialist his whole career. He would have loved to have gotten Cuba. Who cares if it's slave? Makes America strong to expand. That was Douglas's approach, not Lincoln's, not Seward's. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah. Yes, Billy.
Yeah, so my first job out of grad school was in Tennessee, and I'm a Kentucky native, never heard of the Yule Log. Spent many years in Illinois, never heard of the Yule Log. Go to Tennessee, that story was not told. I have been to Booker T. Washington's place, heard that. But this idea at my first job in Tennessee of the happy servants at the house.
Yeah, they don't use the word slave often.
The docents at that site, and it was a National Historic Site, they were telling that story, and I said no, and this was in 2005, they were telling that story, and it was the home of William Blount, and you may be familiar with that. I'm not going to go into that, but he had 27 slaves, and there were articles in the local newspaper about his escaped slaves, and so I could point out to the docents and the board of directors that they were not happy slaves, they were running away, they were escaping, and we need to tell the story that these are not his servants, these were his slaves. Right. And we're going to start telling those stories, and I, of course, had volunteers quit over this idea that that's what we were going to do. But this romanticizing. Then again with Margaret Mitchell and Malcolm Wynne, she wins the Pulitzer Prize for the book. Is it an excellent piece of fiction? Yeah, it's a great story. It's a great movie. It stands up today. It's an excellent piece of fiction. But in the 20th century, that really is where, so many folks get their idea of this great Southern, lifestyle that absolutely did not exist, this romanticizing. But I have not heard the Yule Log story, so that's incredibly interesting.
Yeah, let me pick up on a few things you said there. First of all, especially after the Civil War, they tried to kind of circumvent the term slave, but they did it before the Civil War too, and they used the word servant because the term slave does conjure up images of very hard labor, whereas the term servant is a softer term. But what you bring up is so important, and it was really a lot of what inspired my first book on Christmas and slave times, Yuletide and Dixie, because what I found was that of all the times of the year when slaves ran away, even though it was cold and frigid, and it was colder in those days, there was no global warming, most of the Christmases were cold, and yet they ran away at Christmas time often. I'm not saying that was the only time they ran away. I'm not even saying that it was necessarily the time they ran away the most, but it's up there in the top 2 or 3 months. The reason they run away at Christmas is because, number one, they hate slavery, and number two, the master is he's distracted, right? The master he's drinking, right? He's giving. They got a big Christmas tree and they're giving presents. They're having their own dances where instead of dancing the kind of style the Currier and Ives that I showed you actually is kind of accurate. Black dancing was different than white dancing before the Civil War, but the whites had their, sometimes their European style balls, and they're distracted. The overseer might even be on vacation. That's the perfect time to run away, right? So I also found, and this is a bit more shocking, that they were sometimes whipped over the holiday or otherwise cruelly abused. One ex-slave, when he wrote his later autobiography, said that there was this custom in the Old South that if you said to the master, "Christmas gift," on Christmas morning, you would be rewarded. They'd have to give you a present. And in fact, if the master yelled to the slave, "Christmas gift," then the slave was supposed to give something to the master. And in some cases that actually happened, and they gave a few eggs or something. Maybe they raised their own chickens sometimes. But the fact is that 99% of the gifts were from the masters to the slaves. They purposely tried to lose this game. They wanted to lose this game. It was like giving the slaves a token victory. But the fact is that according to this slave, one Christmas morning, his master ran a tan yard, and the slave was doing his work in the tan yard. They were making leather, and he yelled out at the master, "Christmas gift." The master was in a bad mood. Who knows why? Maybe the master had been fighting with his wife, or the harvest wasn't good. I don't know what happened. But the master got angry at the slave for begging a gift, pushed him in the vat, and then would not let him get out of this boiling vat. And the slave did survive. He managed to swim to the other side and crawled out and survived to tell the story. But that's just one example of cruelty that I've encountered over Christmas. I've run into newspaper accounts of auctions on Christmas Day. There's a wonderful, I shouldn't use the word wonderful, but there's this horrifying account of an Ohioan who was down in Lexington, Kentucky, Henry Clay's hometown, where Clay had his plantation. And he goes to church services on Christmas morning. Wonderful, talking about Jesus' love for humankind and all that stuff. And then he walks out of the church And the sidewalk is so crowded, everyone's milling around on this sidewalk, that he can't walk down the sidewalk. So I think he crosses to the other side and then walks over to see what's going on. I can't remember the exact details, but the gist of it is that when he gets there, he hears the slave auction going on. You know, how much do you bid for this boy? He's strong. He's a likely Negro. That was the term they often used for, you know, for people, for young, hefty African Americans who could do a lot of labor, a likely Negro. So you got the irony that on a day when you're supposed to be thinking of goodwill toward your fellow man, they're auctioning slaves off in the South. So to get to Billy's point, I think, I don't want to suggest that every master was cruel to his enslaved people on Christmas Day. Probably in a large number of Southern homes, if a slave were given a choice, servant or field hand, as to what day of the year he had to go back and, you know, he lived through the Civil War, he's now free, or she's now free, but you get to go back on a time machine to one day of the year when you are going to have to be enslaved again. I'm guessing that 90% of them would have picked Christmas Day, because very few of them worked Christmas Day. Although there were some, we know from diaries, where the master would get angry and he'd say, oh, my slaves didn't pick enough cotton this year. I'm not going to give them Christmas. One master even said what he gave his slaves. He was kind of ticked off at his slaves, so he gave them a few turnips for Christmas. That was his Christmas present. So, you know, but if they had to pick one day, I mean, some slaves did get real presents at Christmas, toys for the kids that were bought in stores. They certainly got extra clothing and blanket, and they needed them to live and stay warm enough so that they could labor the rest of the year. But still, it was the best day in the calendar for many slaves. So I don't want to, the trouble with anything is, you know, you don't want to stereotype it and simplify it and saying the same thing happened everywhere. No. Just like today, we all come from different backgrounds and have different family experiences, different work experiences. They had different experiences. But certainly, there's a lot of mythology. And what I'm trying to do, and what I think the reviews of my book have picked up on, is I'm trying to show how much of the mythology about enslaved experiences before the Civil War was actually crafted by propagandists to make their way of life, to justify the Civil War and 750,000 dead, to make the South reputable enough so that it would get back into the Union again and be fully accepted, and it would only be a few decades before Woodrow Wilson, the Virginian, became president of the United States. So they pulled this off. You know, not a single Southerner was executed for treason because of the Civil War. And so a lot of it is propaganda, and it's crafted to shape public opinion. Yes?
I have a question. With the mythology of this holiday, and obviously Frederick Douglass being very responsible with his grace of the masses, which I'm sure that's all it was. They were going to get turnips or something like that. You mentioned before that possibly they would even go visit other relatives on the locations. That probably never happened.
No, that did happen.
They would let them leave.
They would let them actually leave. They'd have to have a pass.
Yeah.
And that also brings up, in real life, they had to have a pass. If they didn't have the pass, they could be whipped by the slave patrol. But that brings up a very interesting thing. If the Yule Log existed, and I point this out in the book, if the Yule Log existed, how would you know if you were visiting your wife? And you know, some planters own 5 or 6 different plantations. They only got to see their spouses at Christmas time because maybe they're working as a servant in the mansion and their husband's off 2 counties away on a plantation, or even across the river in another state. How are you going to know that the Yule Log just burned out? You know, there's no Pony Express, right? No Pony Express, no telegraphs, no smartphones, no telephones or anything. How do you get the word that the Yule Log burned out and escape punishment? I mean, that's crazy, right? You wouldn't know it had burned out. So if you're going to have Christmas holiday pegged to the Yule log, you can't let your slaves go very far for Christmas. They were allowed to go into New Orleans if they were owned often by sugar planters in the sugar regions around New Orleans. They were allowed to go into New Orleans or other cities and towns in the South for days at a time at Christmas sometimes. So if the Yule log's deciding their vacations, that would be really an impossibility. It's actually indirectly a piece of evidence that the Yule log didn't determine slave vacations at all. I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah. Yes.
Was there an actual slave patrol?
Yes.
Was that a Confederate thing, or was that
No,
an individual?
this was before the Civil War, and they continued it to some degree in the Civil War, but they would send out patrols, especially at times when there were rumors of black rebellions, and that's something else. They would lead you to believe that slaves were content. The masters knew they were content. The slaves were content. There were some of the worst rumors of black rebellions occurred, ironically, at Christmas time. Sometimes they wouldn't let their slaves leave their cabins at Christmas. I'm not saying that happened every year, but the biggest revolt panics, almost every one of the non-revolt revolts in the South that was major, that led to executions of blacks for suspicion of insurrection and that kind of thing, they occurred at Christmas. I'm trying to get back to where we started. You asked?
Slave patrol exists.
Yeah, the slave patrol. So, because, and that in itself leads you to be suspicious of all these stories about how wonderful slaves' times were and how they loved their masters and vice versa. They were worried about revolts, and if there was some reason to fear revolt at a particular time, like the year Lincoln got elected, and there were other problem years, you would then have more slave patrols. And basically the slave owners were required to go out a certain number of hours in these small groups and just question any blacks they saw on the road to make sure they had a legitimate reason for being off the plantation. And you'll see a lot of reference to the slave patrols in black autobiographies of slave times, and they'll talk about the patter rollers. They have their own names for them, but the slave patrols were, now there were some times when the patrols didn't go out. You know, they didn't always need to be out. It was when white people felt endangered.
Have you, I've done quite a bit of work with Harriet Tubman.
Yes.
And as you may or may not know, her first escape is basically one of these Christmas get-togethers, and all of the community, they allowed them to have more time as a family. Her father worked in one plantation, her mother worked in a different one. They get the whole family together, but she got together with three of her brothers, and they all left on Christmas Eve.
On Christmas, yeah.
On 1854.
Yes, that's in my book, actually. I have a whole section of about 10, 20, many of the most famous slaves escaped at Christmas.
Yeah.
And then they wrote about it. So I think the Crafts, William and Ellen Craft, who escaped to England, I think they ran away at Christmas.
Yeah.
Solomon
Northrop,
no, he didn't run away because he was rescued, but he talks a lot about Christmas, and some of them even say we really shouldn't have been partying, we should have been revolting.
You alluded to the fact that there's similarity between the past and the present day. I was wondering if you could give an example of how you see that we're following the same pattern.
Well, the pattern is that we're trying to eradicate from our education and our public culture evidence that would make us uncomfortable as Americans. In other words, the whole thing right now is the directives coming from certain state legislatures and from certain governors and from Washington is it's unpatriotic, really, to drudge up all this dirt.
It's going to say make us as Americans the people who are uncomfortable by those truths are the white people.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure. I know you know this.
Yeah.
It needs to be stated.
Yes, and that's the problem. You see, the people bringing this up don't use the racial designators. They just say, and that's the way they can sell this, supposedly, is that it makes Americans uncomfortable about their country, and we should all be proud of being Americans, as if there isn't a country in the world that doesn't have a dark side to its past.
Everyone, we've kept Professor May for an hour, and all of you as well. I think we owe him a round of applause. Before we do that, if any of you have plans canceled on you at any last minute, apparently the maids will swoop right in. So dinner plans canceled, call Professor May. He'll come right over. He'll give a talk, and they're charming people. We're so grateful to both of you for dropping everything and coming in today, and for an illuminating presentation, and even better, I think, conversation, just like last week. But thank you very much for the 8th time to the maids and Professor Bob.